Marcus Chen stood in the sterile hallway of St. Michael's Children's Hospital, a silk-lined checkbook in his hand and a name he'd sworn never to speak again on his lips. Across town, Richard Hale, the man who'd tried to destroy his company 3 times in 5 years, sat beside a hospital bed, holding the small hand of a daughter who might not see Christmas. The question wasn't whether Marcus would pay for the surgery that could save her. The question was why a man who'd built an empire on winning at any cost would choose to lose this quietly.
Marcus Chen didn't believe in second chances. He believed in quarterly earnings, hostile takeovers, and the clean geometry of a boardroom table where every seat had a price. At 42, he'd turned a failing logistics startup into a coast-to-coast empire, and he'd done it by outmaneuvering men like Richard Hale, men who mistook ambition for vision and desperation for strategy. The wall behind his desk held framed magazine covers, each one a small victory. The shelf beneath held nothing but a single photograph, face down, that he never turned over. It was a Tuesday in November when his assistant, Grace, knocked twice and entered without waiting. She'd worked for him for 8 years and knew the difference between interruption and emergency. This was the latter. She set a folder on his desk, the kind of plain manila that didn't come from their office supply closet, and stepped back. "This arrived by courier an hour ago," she said. "No return address. I had security scan it." Marcus opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a hospital billing statement from St. Michael's Children's Hospital, marked urgent in red ink. The patient's name was Emma Hale, age 7. The procedure listed was a pediatric cardiac transplant. The estimated cost, including surgery, recovery, and 6 months of post-operative care, ran to 7 figures. At the bottom, someone had written in blue pen, "Richard can't cover this. No insurance will touch it. She has 6 weeks." He read it twice, then looked up at Grace. Her expression was carefully neutral, the way it always was when she suspected he was about to make a decision that didn't fit the narrative. "Richard Hale's daughter," Marcus said. "Yes, and someone sent this to me because—" Grace hesitated, then said, "Because you're the only person in this city with the liquidity to move that kind of money overnight and the reputation to make the hospital take it seriously." Marcus leaned back in his chair. Richard Hale. The name tasted like copper, like the memory of a handshake that had turned into a knife in the back. 5 years ago, Hale had tried to poach Marcus's entire West Coast operations team with promises of stock options in corner offices. When that failed, he'd leaked proprietary route data to a competitor, nearly costing Marcus a government contract worth $30 million. They'd settled out of court, but the damage was done. Since then, they'd circled each other in industry conferences and merger talks, 2 apex predators who'd learned to stay out of each other's territory. And now someone thought Marcus would pay to save his rival's child. He closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. "Return it. No note." Grace didn't move. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She picked up the folder but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Marcus, Emma Hale is 7 years old. She didn't choose her father." Marcus turned his chair toward the window, where the city spread out in clean lines of steel and glass. "Neither did I." That night, Marcus stayed late at the office, the way he always did when a decision felt too easy. The building was empty except for the cleaning crew, and the only light came from his desk lamp and the skyline beyond the glass. He opened his laptop and typed Emma Hale's name into the search bar, telling himself it was due diligence, nothing more. The results were sparse. A few local news stories about a charity run Hale had organized last year, a fundraiser for pediatric cardiology research. There was a photo of Richard and his daughter at the finish line, both wearing matching t-shirts that read, "Heartbeats Matter." Emma was small for 7, with dark curls and a gap-toothed smile. Richard's hand rested on her shoulder, and his expression was the kind of unguarded joy that didn't belong to the man Marcus remembered. He closed the laptop and stood. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch from the bar cart in the corner, drank it in one swallow, and poured another. The photograph on the shelf caught his eye, the one he kept face down. He didn't turn it over. But he thought about it. He thought about the boy he'd been at 7, before his own father's business collapsed, before the foreclosure and the scholarship that had saved him and the years of clawing his way up from nothing. He thought about the promises he'd made to himself in the dark, that he'd never be weak, never be caught without leverage, never let sentiment cloud his judgment. He thought about a little girl who had 6 weeks. The next morning, Marcus called his attorney. I need you to set up an anonymous fund, offshore account routed through a medical trust, no paper trail that leads back to me. His attorney, David, had handled stranger requests. How much are we talking about? $2 million, enough to cover a transplant and recovery at St. Michael's Children's Hospital. The beneficiary is Emma Hale, Richard Hale's daughter. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Richard Hale, as in, yes. Marcus, I have to ask. Don't. Just set it up. I want the money transferred by end of business today. David exhaled slowly. All right, but if this ever comes out, it won't. Marcus hung up and returned to his email. By noon, the fund was established. By 3, the hospital had received a wire transfer with instructions to apply it to Emma Hale's care. By 5, Marcus was in a board meeting, negotiating the terms of a merger in Portland, and the whole thing felt like something that happened to someone else. Grace knocked on his office door at 6. The hospital confirmed receipt. They've scheduled Emma's surgery for next week. Marcus nodded without looking up from his notes. Good. Richard Hale is apparently trying to find out who made the donation. He's called every major donor in the city. He won't find anything. She set a cup of coffee on his desk, black, no sugar, the way he'd taken it for 20 years. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Marcus met her eyes. I didn't do it to be right. I did it because a child shouldn't die for her father's mistakes. Grace smiled, the kind of sad, knowing smile that suggested she understood more than he'd said. Maybe that's the same thing. After she left, Marcus stood and walked to the window. Somewhere across the city, Richard Hale was sitting in a hospital room, holding his daughter's hand, and wondering who'd just saved her life. He imagined the relief, the confusion, the desperate gratitude that would have no target. He imagined Richard's face if he ever found out the truth. And he imagined what his own father might have said if he'd lived long enough to see his son choose mercy over victory. But that was a question with no answer, and Marcus had built his empire on certainties, so he returned to his desk, opened a new file, and got back to work. But the photograph on the shelf stayed face down, and this time he didn't think about turning it over.
Emma Hale's surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday, just after dawn. Marcus knew this because Grace had quietly added the date to his calendar, a single line in blue text that read EH Procedure, St. Michael's, 6 a.m. He didn't ask her to remove it. Instead, he found himself checking his phone throughout the day, refreshing news alerts and hospital press releases, searching for confirmation that the transplant had gone well. It had. By noon, the hospital issued a brief statement. The surgery was a success, and the patient was in stable condition. Marcus read it twice, closed his phone, and told himself that was the end of it. But Richard Hale was not a man who accepted miracles quietly. Within 48 hours of the donation, he'd launched a full investigation into the anonymous benefactor. He hired a forensic accountant, contacted every philanthropic foundation in the region, and made a public plea on the local news, standing outside St. Michael's with Emma's stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand and a microphone in the other. "Someone saved my daughter's life," Richard said, his voice breaking on the last word. "I don't know who you are, but I will find you, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know what you've done for us." Marcus watched the clip from his office, his expression unreadable. Grace stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "He's not going to let this go." "I know." "What if he figures it out?" Marcus closed his laptop. "He won't. David's too good at his job." But even as he said it, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. Richard Hale was relentless when he wanted something, and gratitude was a powerful motivator. If he dug deep enough, if he connected the right dots, he might find a thread that led back to Marcus. And then what?
Would Richard see it as an act of kindness or as the ultimate power move, a reminder that Marcus could give and take away at will? The question gnawed at him through the rest of the week. He threw himself into work, approving 3 new logistics contracts and flying to Seattle for a site inspection, but the image of Richard's face on the news kept surfacing in his mind. He told himself it was simple risk management, nothing more. But late at night, alone in his penthouse with the city lights stretching to the horizon, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Emma Hale was released from the hospital on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the surgery. Richard carried her out himself, her small arms wrapped around his neck, her face pale but smiling. A crowd of reporters waited outside, and Richard stopped long enough to thank the anonymous donor once more, his voice thick with emotion. "Whoever you are, you gave me my daughter back. I'll never forget that." Marcus watched the footage from his car, parked 3 blocks away from the hospital. He told himself he was in the area for a meeting, but the meeting had ended an hour ago, and he'd driven here without consciously deciding to. Now he sat in silence, watching Richard carry Emma to a waiting car, and felt something shift in his chest, a tightness he couldn't name. When Richard's car pulled away, Marcus started his engine and drove back to the office, but the tightness didn't leave. It stayed with him through the afternoon, through a conference call with investors, through dinner alone at his desk, and when Grace knocked on his door at 7, holding another plain manila folder, he knew before she spoke that the investigation had found something. Richard's accountant traced the donation to the medical trust. He hasn't identified the donor yet, but he's close. David thinks you have maybe a week before he connects it to your offshore accounts. Marcus took the folder and skimmed the report inside. The accountant had done solid work, peeling back layers of shell companies and wire transfers with the precision of a surgeon. Another few days, and Richard would be O. "What do you want to do?" Grace asked. Marcus set the folder down. "Nothing. Let him find out." Grace blinked. "You're serious?" "If he's going to know, better he find out on his own than hear it from me. At least then he'll believe it's real." "And what if he thinks you did it as some kind of power play?" "Then he's wrong. But that's his problem, not mine." Grace studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll let David know." After she left, Marcus stood and walked to the window. The city glittered below, a maze of light and shadow, and somewhere in it, Richard Hale was putting his daughter to bed, kissing her forehead, and whispering promises he'd nearly lost the chance to keep. Marcus thought about what it would feel like to be on the other side of that moment, to be the father, not the benefactor, to have someone depending on him not for profit or strategy, but for love. The photograph on the shelf was still face down. He reached for it, hesitated, and then turned it over. The boy in the picture was 7 years old, with Marcus's eyes and his father's smile. He was standing in front of a house that no longer existed, holding a baseball glove that had been sold at a yard sale 3 months after the photo was taken. Marcus stared at the image, and for the first time in years, he let himself remember what it felt like to be that boy. Before the betrayals, before the empire, before he'd learned that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford.
Richard Hale showed up at Marcus's office on a Monday morning, unannounced and unescorted. Grace tried to intercept him in the lobby, but he brushed past her with the single-minded focus of a man who'd run out of patience. By the time Marcus's door flew open, Richard was already inside, his face flushed and his hands clenched into fists. "It was you," Richard said. Marcus looked up from his computer. He'd been expecting this moment for days, but the reality of it still hit like a punch to the chest. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Richard." "I'm not sitting. I want to know why." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "Why what?" "Why you paid for Emma's surgery, why you didn't tell me, why you—" Richard's voice cracked and he stopped, pressing a hand to his mouth. When he spoke again, it was quieter, almost broken. "Why you saved my daughter when I've spent the last 5 years trying to destroy you." Marcus let the silence stretch. Outside, the city hummed with traffic and construction, the white noise of a world that didn't care about their small drama.
Finally, he said, "Because she's 7 years old, and because no child should pay for their father's choices." Richard stared at him. "That's it? That's your reason? What other reason do you need?" "I don't know. Maybe I thought you'd want something in return. A truce, a deal, some kind of leverage." Marcus stood and walked to the window. "I don't want anything, Richard. I never did. The donation was anonymous because I didn't want you to feel obligated. I didn't want this conversation." "Then why did you do it?" "Because I remember what it's like to lose everything. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even you." Richard's shoulders sagged. He sank into the chair Marcus had offered, his hands gripping the armrests. "I tried to ruin you. 3 times. I leaked your data. I poached your team. I know. And I've spent 5 years making sure you couldn't do it again. But Emma didn't do any of that. She's just a kid who got sick, and she deserved a chance." Richard looked up at him, his eyes red-rimmed. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't," Marcus said. "You take care of your daughter. You watch her grow up, and you remember that the world isn't as small as we think it is. That's enough." Richard wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I spent the last 2 weeks hating you for not telling me, and now I'm sitting here and I don't know what to feel." "Then feel grateful, and let that be the end of it." Richard nodded slowly. He stood, hesitated, and then extended his hand. Marcus looked at it for a long moment before shaking it. The grip was firm, deliberate, nothing like the hollow gesture they'd exchanged at industry events. This was something else. An acknowledgement, maybe, or a truce. When Richard left, the office felt quieter than it had in weeks. Grace appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. "How did it go?" "Better than expected," Marcus said. "He knows, and he's not angry." "What is he then?" Marcus thought about the question. "Humbled, maybe. Or just tired. I don't know. But it's done." Grace smiled. "Good. You did the right thing." Marcus returned to his desk, but he didn't open his computer. Instead, he thought about Richard's face, the way it had shifted from anger to confusion to something that looked almost like relief. He thought about Emma and about the life she'd have now, the birthdays and school plays and quiet mornings that she had almost missed. And he thought about the choice he'd made, the one that hadn't fit the narrative, the one that might have been the first honest thing he'd done in years. The photograph on the shelf was still turned over. Marcus picked it up and set it upright, where he could see it every time he looked up from his work. The boy in the picture stared back at him, holding his baseball glove, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't feel the need to look away. A week later, Marcus received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten on pale blue stationery, and the return address was Richard Hale's home. Marcus opened it at his desk, with Grace watching from the doorway. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was a child's, careful and uneven, and the message was short. "Dear Mr. Chen, my dad told me you helped me when I was sick. Thank you for making me better. I drew you a picture of a heart because mine is working now. I hope you like it. Love, Emma." Tucked into the envelope was a crayon drawing of a red heart surrounded by stars. Marcus stared at it for a long time, then set it on his desk beside the photograph. Grace didn't say anything, but I saw her smile as she turned to leave. That night, Marcus went home early for the first time in months. He poured himself a drink and sat by the window watching the sunset over the city. The drawing was in his briefcase, and he thought about framing it, hanging it on the wall where the magazine covers used to be. It wasn't a trophy, it wasn't proof of victory, but it was something better. A reminder that success wasn't always measured in quarterly earnings or boardroom battles. Sometimes it was measured in crayon hearts and second chances. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus thought that maybe, just maybe, he'd gotten it right. 3 months after Emma's surgery, Richard Hale called Marcus's office with a proposal. Grace transferred the call without commentary, and Marcus answered on the second ring, unsure what to expect. "I need a favor," Richard said. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "You don't know me anything, Richard.
We settled that. This isn't about settling debts, it's about doing something useful. Richard paused, and Marcus could hear the sound of traffic in the background, as if he were calling from his car. I'm starting a foundation, pediatric cardiac care for families who can't afford it. I want you to help me run it. Marcus blinked. You want me to what? Run it. Co-chair, technically. You've got the infrastructure, the connections, the reputation. I've got the story and the drive. Together, we could fund surgeries for kids like Emma, kids whose parents are one medical bill away from losing everything. Marcus rubbed his temples. Richard, I run a logistics company. I'm not a philanthropist. You were when it mattered, Richard said. And you did it anonymously, which means you weren't doing it for the PR. That's the kind of person I need on this. Someone who understands what it's like to lose everything and fights like hell to make sure no one else has to. Marcus didn't answer right away. He thought about Emma's drawing, still pinned to the corkboard beside his desk. He thought about the boy in the photograph, the one who'd lost his father's house and his childhood in the space of a single summer. And he thought about the version of himself who'd spent 20 years building walls and calling it strategy. I'll think about it, Marcus said finally. Good. That's all I'm asking. Richard hung up and Marcus sat in silence staring at the phone. Grace appeared in the doorway a moment later, her expression expectant. He wants me to help him start a foundation, Marcus said. And I told him I'd think about it. You're going to say yes. I didn't say that. You didn't have to, Grace said. I've worked for you for 8 years, Marcus. I know when you've already made up your mind. She left before he could argue, and Marcus turned back to his desk. But she was right. He'd already decided. He just needed a few days to admit it to himself. The foundation launched in May with a quiet press conference at St. Michael's Children's Hospital. Richard stood at the podium, Emma by his side, and spoke about second chances and the kindness of strangers. Marcus stood off to the side, his hands in his pockets, and watched as reporters scribbled notes and cameras flashed. When Richard finished, he gestured for Marcus to join him at the podium. This foundation wouldn't exist without Marcus Chen. He saved my daughter's life when he had every reason not to, and now he's helping me make sure other families get the same chance. I'm honored to call him my partner in this. The applause was polite, professional, but Marcus barely heard it. He was looking at Emma, who stood beside her father with a shy smile, her hand gripping a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. She caught his eye and waved, and Marcus waved back. After the conference, Marcus and Richard stood in the hospital lobby, watching as the reporters filed out. Emma had gone upstairs to visit the nurses who'd cared for her, and the two men were alone for the first time since the foundation's launch. Thank you, Richard said, for agreeing to this. Don't thank me yet, Marcus said. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. I know, but I think we can handle it. Marcus nodded. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Richard said, I spent 5 years thinking you were the enemy. I was wrong about you. You weren't entirely wrong, Marcus said. I wasn't exactly kind. No, but you were human, and that's more than I gave you credit for. Richard extended his hand and Marcus shook it. This time the gesture felt lighter, less weighted with history. They were no longer rivals and they weren't quite friends, but they were something new. Two men who'd found common ground in the wreckage of their old battles. Over the next 6 months, the foundation grew faster than either of them expected. Donations poured in from corporations and private donors, and the waiting list for surgeries stretched to 50 families. Marcus handled the logistics, contracts, hospital partnerships, insurance negotiations, while Richard managed outreach and fundraising. They met every week, sometimes at Marcus's office, sometimes at a coffee shop near the hospital, and they talked about budgets and case files, and the small miracles they were making possible. Emma was their unofficial mascot. She appeared at fundraisers with her father, shaking hands and posing for photos, her gap-toothed smile a reminder of why the work mattered. She also sent Marcus cards, thank you notes, holiday greetings, drawings of hearts and stars, and he kept every one of them in a folder on his desk. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, Richard invited Marcus to dinner at his home. Marcus hesitated, unsure how to navigate the shift from the boardroom to the living room, but Richard insisted. "Emma's been asking about you. She wants to thank you in person." Marcus arrived at 7, carrying a bottle of wine and a small gift for Emma, a children's book about astronauts that he'd found at a bookstore near his office. Richard's home was modest, a 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood, with a front yard full of autumn leaves and a tire swing hanging from an oak tree. Emma answered the door, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Mr. Chen," she said, pulling him inside. "Dad said you were coming." Marcus handed her the book, and she clutched it to her chest. "Thank you. I love space." Dinner was simple: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and the conversation was easy, lighter than Marcus had expected. Richard talked about Emma's school play, and Emma talked about her teacher's pet turtle, and Marcus found himself laughing more than he had in years. When dessert arrived, chocolate cake with too much frosting, Emma insisted on sitting next to Marcus, peppering him with questions about his job and his favorite color and whether he liked dogs or cats better. "Dogs," Marcus said, "but I don't have one." "You should get one," Emma said. "Dogs are good company." After dinner, Richard walked Marcus to the door. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It meant a lot to Emma. And to me. Thank you for inviting me." And he meant it. On the drive home, Marcus thought about the evening, the warmth of the house, the sound of Emma's laughter, the way Richard had smiled when his daughter asked for a second slice of cake. It was the kind of ordinary, unremarkable happiness that Marcus had spent his life chasing in all the wrong places. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe he'd been looking at success all wrong. Maybe it wasn't about quarterly earnings or corner offices. Maybe it was about moments like this, small, fleeting, and utterly unreplaceable. When he got home, he opened his laptop and started drafting an email to his attorney. He was going to set up a trust for Emma's college fund and maybe a scholarship program for kids who'd been through the same thing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all you needed.
A year after the Foundation's launch, Marcus and Richard stood on the roof of St. Michael's Children's Hospital, watching as workers installed a bronze plaque on the wall of the new cardiac wing. The plaque read, "The Emma Hale Pavilion, founded by Richard Hale and Marcus Chen, in honor of second chances." "Hard to believe we pulled this off," Richard said. "We had help," Marcus said. "A lot of it." Richard smiled. "True, but it started with you." They descended the stairs and walked through the new wing, past rooms filled with equipment and beds that would save lives. Emma was waiting for them in the lobby, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a coloring book. She looked up when they approached and grinned. "Can I see my name?" she asked. "Later," Richard said, "after the ribbon cutting." The ceremony was scheduled for the following week, and the guest list included donors, hospital staff, and a dozen families whose children had been helped by the foundation. Marcus had agreed to speak, though he'd been dreading it for days. Public speaking wasn't his strength, and the idea of standing in front of a crowd, admitting that he'd been wrong about so many things, felt like stepping off a cliff. But when the day came and he stood at the podium with Emma and Richard by his side, the words came easier than he had expected. "I used to think success was about winning, about being the smartest, the fastest, the most ruthless. But a year ago, I learned that success is about something else. It's about showing up when it matters. It's about doing the right thing even when no one's watching. And it's about giving people, especially kids like Emma, the chance to live the lives they deserve." The applause was loud and sustained, and Marcus stepped back from the microphone, his hands shaking slightly. Richard clapped him on the shoulder, and Emma grabbed his hand, squeezing it tight. After the ceremony, Marcus found himself standing alone in the new wing, looking at the plaque. The words felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else's story. But they were his. He'd earned them, not through strategy or leverage, but through something simpler: a choice to be kind when it would have been easier to walk away. Grace found him there a few minutes later. "You did good, Marcus. We did good. This wasn't just me." "Maybe not.
But you started it, and that matters." Marcus nodded, and they stood in silence, watching as families streamed into the new wing, their faces full of hope. It was the kind of moment that didn't fit into quarterly reports or shareholder meetings, the kind of moment that couldn't be quantified or measured. But it was real, and it was enough. 2 years later, the foundation had funded over 200 surgeries and expanded to 3 additional hospitals. Marcus had stepped back from day-to-day operations at his logistics company, handing more control to Grace, and now he spent most of his time with the foundation, reviewing case files, meeting with donors, and occasionally visiting families whose children were awaiting surgery. Emma was 9 now, tall for her age, with her father's determination and her mother's laugh. She still sent Marcus cards, birthday cards, thank you notes, drawings of the stars she wanted to visit someday, and he still kept every one. She'd also started volunteering at the hospital, reading to younger patients and helping nurses deliver meal trays. Richard joked that she was going to be a doctor someday, and Marcus believed it. One evening, Marcus received a call from Richard. "I need to tell you something," Richard said. His voice was serious, and Marcus braced for bad news. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the ribbon cutting, about doing the right thing when no one's watching, and I realized I never really thanked you. Not properly." "Richard, you've thanked me 100 times. Not for saving Emma, for teaching me what it means to be a better person. You didn't have to help me. You didn't owe me anything. But you did it anyway, and that changed everything." I didn't know what to say. I sat in silence, the phone pressed to my ear, and thought about the man Richard had been, the rival, the enemy, the adversary who tried to destroy him. And then I thought about the man Richard was now, the father, the partner, the friend. People can change, they can grow, and sometimes all it took was one act of unexpected kindness to set them on a different path. "You did the work, Richard," Marcus said. "I just gave you a reason to start." When they hung up, Marcus stood and walked to the window. The city stretched out before him, glittering and alive, and he thought about the boy in the photograph, the one who'd lost everything and learned to fight for every inch of ground he'd gained. That boy was still part of him, but he wasn't the whole story anymore. Now there was Emma, and the foundation, and the families they had helped. Now there was a legacy that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings, and everything to do with the choice to show up when it mattered. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he'd finally won something that mattered.
5 years after the Foundation's launch, Marcus stood in the lobby of St. Michael's Children's Hospital, watching as Emma Hale addressed a crowd of donors and volunteers. She was 14 now, poised and confident, her voice steady as she spoke about the families the Foundation had helped and the work that still needed to be done. "My dad and Mr. Chen taught me that success isn't about how much you have," Emma said. "It's about what you do with it, and I hope that everyone here will remember that when they go home tonight." The applause was thunderous, and Marcus clapped along, his chest tight with pride. Richard stood beside him, his eyes bright. "She's gonna change the world," Richard said. "She already has," Marcus said. After the event, Emma found Marcus in the crowd and hugged him. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Chen." "You did this, Emma," Marcus said. "Not me." "Maybe, but you started it." She pulled back and smiled, and Marcus saw in her face the same determination that had driven him for so many years. But in Emma, it was tempered by kindness, by empathy, by the knowledge that winning wasn't the point. The point was showing up. The point was caring. The point was making sure that the next kid who got sick didn't have to face it alone. Marcus left the hospital that night with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The city glittered around him, full of light and noise and possibility, and he thought about the choice he'd made all those years ago, the choice to fund a surgery for a rival's child, to step outside the narrative, to risk everything for nothing in return. It hadn't made sense at the time. It still didn't, not really. But it had mattered, and in the end, that was all that counted.